Now, if you had to think about the best place to invest in Africa, South Africa would be at the top of most people's lists. But that isn't the case for Rand Merchant Bank. According to Where to Invest in Africa 2021 report, Egypt is number one. Morocco is in second place, while South Africa gets the bronze medal. So what makes the land for pharaohs such an attractive investment destination? Economist Daniel Kavishe speaks to us now about this. Daniel, many thanks for your time this evening. And I suppose we'll start with that very question. What is it about Egypt that makes it at the top in terms of investment destinations?
Just using your same metaphor, it simply must be then the tourism, given the fact that they've got pyramids. But no, not really. We saw during the course of 2020 that tourism sector, which is actually the pinnacle and the cornerstone for most of our economic environments, was completely decimated by the pandemic. So when we had to unpack our top 10, our top 5 investment destinations across the continent, we had to take a more nuanced approach. And what we found for Egypt was simply that it entered the crisis at a much better footing than most other African economies. Now, for context, Egypt has been through an IMF program, and that speaks to the fiscal prudence that was required by the authorities over the past few years in terms of building up reserves to ensure that they're resilient through tumultuous times, ensuring that they kept their debt appetite at a minimum level, or rather at a sustainable level, but more importantly, channeling most of their funds towards sectors that would actually drive economic growth. Now, Egypt is a large economy similar to South Africa, but isn't it surprising that in the past few years, it's an economy that's been able to grow north of 3 to 4%, while we've had an economy like South Africa, strong manufacturing base, strong wholesale and retail trade. It entered the pandemic basically in a recessionary environment, barely growing by about 1 or 2%. So I think that would be one of the strong reasons why then Egypt has featured as the top country at this moment across the continent. And in addition to that, it also has a more than palatable operating environment for investors around the world.
Yeah, all the things you've just said about Egypt, South Africa has struggled with many of these structural reforms, policy uncertainty, and yet the country still came in at number 3, which is not a bad positioning considering the various other countries that were looked at here. So I suppose broadly then, what would inform a decent investment destination, particularly when it comes to South Africa?
So if you consider South Africa, and it's a good point you raise, it's got a big and large manufacturing base. It's got a significantly sizable wholesale and retail trade sector. Now, if you look at the trade across the region, the immediate neighbors to South Africa probably rely anywhere between 30 to 50% on a monthly basis for imports that are coming in from South African firms. That definitely puts South Africa in good stead. Another thing to consider is that it has one of the deepest financial sectors across the continent, as several listed entities, but then also easily accessible investment instruments such as bonds and treasury bills, which are being tapped into not only by local institutions, but also international ones. So South Africa has the underpinnings to actually be number 1. So then, to your point, what has made it slip? And one of the things that we've found for the South African base is over time, there's been a deterioration, in the way in which businesses have stated how easy it is to operate in this market. It's becoming increasingly difficult to deal with issues of graft, whether it's dealing with procurement policies from a government tender side, or whether it's dealing with smaller issues at a private sector level. It's become increasingly difficult as well as a country to deal with your biggest socio-economic issues across the country. As you're well aware, now during the pandemic, we saw some pretty scathing unemployment numbers that were less than flattering. We've had a problem of inequality for quite some time. And this is actually then what detracts from South Africa's score. If the country has a designated approach strategy to deal with some of these issues, in my mind, they would be able to move higher up across the ranks, just relative to other economies. It's still quite a strong one. But I think these issues that I've mentioned are problematic and will negate from South Africa over time in terms of improving in rankings, but then also in terms of their general investability.
Yeah, and I suppose here, Daniel, it's going to be important for governments, not just in South Africa, but in all emerging and other markets, that we reimagine the way we create trade relationships, the way we determine policies, so that we are able to continue to garner those important investments, especially in the time of the pandemic.
Absolutely. So, if you consider, there's been lots of talk up until today about, as an example, the Continental Free Trade Area. It's been on the cards for quite some time, effectively going into action at the beginning of this year, in quotes. And when I say that is, we're in this environment where, as a continent, we want to tap into trade with each other to improve inter-trade levels, which, by our estimates during the course of last year, improved to maybe 21 or 22%, when really it should be as high as 60%. We've reached this stage, but we're still dealing with operational issues, such as rules of origin between two countries. That in itself is just a part of the bigger problem that the African continent is facing. But then also, I keep going on around this point. We don't have a strong manufacturing base as a continent. We've created reliance to international entities over the past few years by systematically using our primary industries as a basis for exports without beneficiating on the continent. And this is now becoming problematic for the bulk of the continent, because then we don't have a lot of products that are being produced domestically. And then we have this horde of international products that are coming in at a much higher level that are still, quite prevalent in the continent. And so we're in this very awkward position where the continent developed from a primary industry, so very extractive with agricultural basis. And then we saw it sort of just skirt the middle secondary industry section where we're supposed to be dealing with manufacturing and increasing labor force participation. And we went straight to tertiary industries, your tourism, your financial services, etc. And this middle gap, in my view, is one of the bigger problems facing the continent that we need to address if we're going to be, global contenders, and if we're also going to be prepared for some of these structural changes that you mentioned are so necessary for post-pandemic strong performance or post-pandemic success.